Hey, thank you. When the reader tears up at the introduction, you know, the whole evening is in trouble. We'll see what we can do here. It is a great pleasure to be here again at the Loft. I think you know that not every American city has the kind of literary community, the energy, the sense of a communal project around the written and spoken word that exists here in Minneapolis, here in the Twin Cities. That kind of culture happens because many people put their shoulder to the wheel and open their pocketbooks and participate and, you know, just show up and continue to build something. The results of it are remarkable. I mean, this place in which we find ourselves tonight, the number of people coming to workshops, you know, from just starting out, wanting to say something, and then gradually building their skills, reading more widely, until we see that stack of 96 manuscripts showing up in that big, heavy box, dominating my living room. And full of wonderful poetry. You know, I've judged many contests, and it's often the case that there are a few bright gems in a rather murky sea. In this case, here were so many wonderful poems, and that's really because of the energy and the passion that's gone into this work. It also, you know, has to do with your city hosting a press which is now not only a national presence, but a global one, in being the American publisher of the most recent Nobel Prize winner and of our celebrated Pulitzer winner as well. Gray Wolf is an extraordinary advocate for American literature, and a great pleasure for me is to be involved with them in several ways, but one of which is the editorship of the Gray Wolf Poetry Review Series. And what the review series aims to do is to bring poets back out of darkness, poets whose work has fallen out of print, which can happen so easily. You know, the vagaries of publication and of reputation. Often marvelous work may go unseen for a while, but I believe that which is most urgent, most valuable to us will always find its way into the light. Witness the two, I want to say the two greatest American poets of the 19th century, but we could simply say the two greatest American poets, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. How is it possible that that work came to be translated into every language in which poetry is translated? And at this moment, somebody is reading Emily Dickinson, probably everywhere in the world, a poet who simply put her poems in a box, right? The poems found their way. Well, with Fiona McRae and Jeff Schatz, I conceived the notion for this series, and one of the reasons I wanted to do it is because a long time ago, early 80s, I fell in love with this book by James L. White, a Minneapolis poet, and I wanted to honor this place to begin this evening with a poem of his. White was a gay poet who found a way to speak openly and directly about his experience, and yet his poems are not about gayness. That's not their subject. Their subject is love, loss, desire, the inevitable disappointments of love and desire. And it was a poetry that, for me, opened many doors of possibility. So I want to read for you first of all this evening, probably my favorite James L. White poem. I think it's his masterwork. It also happens to be one of a very small number of American poems spoken by a masturbating speaker. You got it? Yeah? So here we go. It's called Making Love to Myself. When I do it, I remember how it was with us. Then my hands remember too, and you're with me again, just the way it was. After work, when you'd come in and turn the TV off and sit on the edge of the bed, filling the room with gasoline smell from your overalls, trying not to wake me, which you always did. I'd breathe out long and say, "Hi, Jess. You tired, baby?" You'd say, "Not so bad," and rub my belly. Not after me, really, just being sweet. And I always thought I'd die a little, because you smelled like burnt leaves or wood smoke. We were poor as Job's turkey, but we lived well. the food, a few good movies, good dope, lots of talk, lots of you and me trying on each other's skin. What a sweet gift this is, done with my memory, my cock and hands. Sometimes I'd wake up wondering if I should fix coffee for us before work, almost thinking you're here again, almost seeing your work jacket on the chair. I wonder if you remember what we promised when you took the job in Laramie, our way of staying with each other. We promised there'd always be times when the sky was perfectly lucid, that we could remember each other through that. You could remember me at my work table or in the all-night diners, though we'd never call or write. I just have to stop here, Jess. I just have to stop. So I'm going to read you mostly new work this evening. I begin with a poem which took a while to come into being. I have, over the course of a number of years, written a fair number of poems in which dogs do something instructive, provocative, questionable, and that becomes an occasion for a philosophical meditation, a moral question. And I said, no, I'm not going to write any more of those. I'm done. And I got a new dog. And I tried mightily to resist, and I resisted, and I resisted. And this is Ned's first poem. It's called Deep Lane. June 23rd, evening of the first fireflies. We're walking in the cemetery down the road, and I look up from my distracted study of whatever, an unfocused gaze somewhere in the direction of my shoes, and see that Ned has run on ahead, with the champagne plume of his tail held especially high, his head erect, which is often a sign that he has something he believes he is not allowed to have. And in the gathering twilight, what is it that is gathered? Who is doing the harvesting? I can make out that the long horizontal between his lovely jaws is one of the 4 stakes planted on the slope to indicate where the backhoe will dig a new grave. Of course, my impulse is to run after him, to replace the marker, out of respect for the taboo that we won't desecrate the tombs, or at least the particular knowledge of those who knew the woman whose name inks a placard in the rectangle claimed by the 4 poles of vanishing. Well, 3 poles now. And how it's within their recollection, their gathering, she'll live. Evening of memory, spark lamps in the grass. I stand and watch him go in his wild figure 8s. I say, you run, darling. You tear up that hill. So you may have noticed that that poem has a title which has ostensibly nothing to do with it. Deep Lane is a road out towards the far eastern end of Long Island. I have a house out there. And the road itself is pretty, but nothing special. But there's something about the name, Deep Lane, the 2 monosyllables, the 2 vowels, that started to resonate in my imagination and to draw possibilities toward itself. In other words, to become a metaphor. So I wrote a Deep Lane poem, and then that wasn't enough, so I wrote another one, and now there are about a dozen of them. So here's another one. This one has to do with the experience of acquiring a new garden. But it's a garden that was first planted by someone else, which means that everything must be changed. Nothing will do. And at some point during this labor, I began to question, who's this for? Why am I doing this? The poem also remembers the late Deborah Diggs, a marvelous poet who died now about 4 years ago. Deep Lane. When I'm down on my knees, pulling up wild mustard by the roots before it sets seed, hauling the old ferns further into the shade, I'm talking to the anvil of darkness. Break table. Slab no blow could dent, rung with the making. And out of that chop and rot comes the fresh surf of the lupins. When the shovel slips into white root flesh, into the meat coursing with cool water, when I'm grubbing on my knees, what is the hammer? dusky skin of the tuber, naked worms who write on the soil every letter, my companion blind. All day we go digging, harrowing, rooting deep. Spade plunge and trowel, sweet turned-down gas flames, slow charring carbon, out of which sprouts the wild unsayable. Beauty's the least of it. You get ready, like Deborah, who used to garden in the dark, hauling out candles and a tall glass of what she said was tea, and digging and reading and studying in the dirt. She'd bring a dictionary. If study is prayer, she said, I'm praying. If you've already gone down to the anvil, if you've rested your face on that adamantine, maybe you're already changed. So this poem also situates itself in the garden and evokes the theological notion of Manichaeanism, that old heresy which suggests that the world is divided into forces of good and evil, darkness and light, and that the outcome of the struggle is not yet known. The church decided that was a bad idea, that philosophy. Deep lane. Into Eden came the ticks, princes of this world, heat-seeking, tiny, multitudinous. Lord, why have you given them a heart, a nervous system, a lit microchip, a brain, is it? If not to invite Manichaeanism. Hard to believe the force that shaped the mild tortoise traversing the undergrowth with smallest steps, the sway-necked lily. Hard to countenance that same mind dotting paradise with pinhead demons wanting nothing but to gorge, to suck beyond the dreams of their hell brothers, the mosquitoes. Implacable, without boundary, pure appetite. I wouldn't know anything about that. Sympathy for the tick. Underworld. The new and towering boy in Outpatient folds the lavish scaffold of himself into a smallish chair, as though it were an ongoing task to account for all his parts. And he takes us in, nods his smudge of beard, and smiles privately. We've confirmed his expectations. No malice or irony in it, simply a kind of sweetness. He's failed to kill himself last weekend and has landed intact, marveling, interested. His legs, I want to spell long with two N's, as Milton spelled dim with a double M to intensify the gloom of hell, craning into one another, then pushing his knees forward into the speaking circle where we weigh 90 minutes, the tonnage of our shame, the damage yours, only until exactly spoken. Whose pain's not a common one? And then the new man, all of 22, stretches his legs entirely forward and catches my breath with a name printed across the tongues of his shoes, Osiris, in bold letters. Maybe a brand too newly stylish for me to have registered, but the unlaced word prays for us to just the right God, him torn to pieces, each bit of his ruin picked up, each nearly unrecognizable attended, carried, and mourned, and is it loved or willed back into place, the man and boy's body radiantly restored. Or that's the hope he's poking out at us with his excellent shoes, while we go on talking until lunchtime. This is a new poem, so I know it seems gimmicky, but honestly, it doesn't exist on paper. This is it. And that means, should you ever run across this poem again, it may be quite different. I don't know. It has to do with the experience. Some of you've had this, many of you have had the experience. When you participate in something that, maybe you go to a writing workshop or something that's just a little more new age than you quite want to put credence in exactly, you know? But then something happens. you know what I mean. Okay. God box. The thing we most want to be released from. That's what we're asked to write on an index card, then to fold it. We're given a paper box, the sort of white cube in which you might place a gift, and told to write or draw on the box our image of God, whoever or whatever that might be. We're here. We have, in principle, already agreed. Some men use words, putting one in larger letters on each side, and some of us choose to draw. Daniel's octopus is a Buddha, Glenn's highest self a blazing star, though no markers adequately golden. My greening opens onto what might be future blue, one hand opened out of another in a long linked chain, some rush of wind from another life. We describe our boxes aloud around our table. Then we're asked to take the card, place it inside, and close the lid. I'm inclined to toss the thing away on 6th Avenue, thinking it's intention and not artifact that matters, but I wind up walking blocks, past my train station even, holding a coffer only a little bigger than the hand that closes around it. Steam pours up from a curb's open vent, thick glassy slab of winter twilight over the stairs to the subway, over the too bright windows of banks, silhouettes of the park's trees ascendant, as if the veins in our own lungs hung mirrored in the air over people hurrying in their dark coats. Then I'm in the station, restless, walking the long platform, and there's the unnameable of music before you're close enough to recognize what the music is or even how it's made. Keep walking, a violin. Keep walking, sonorous and emotive, closer, resolute travelers facing the tracks, but still a few turn toward the violinist, his powers concentrated on his instrument, from which resonates, how is it possible, a distillate of human feeling so aching I suddenly don't need to go anywhere. One blue hand folding out of another, one golden octopus, one embattled star. $2 and change, a CD for sale in the velvet cavity of the case beside his shoes. An odd bit of movement across the tracks, so you can't help but look toward the uptown platform where a tall black man, why does that suddenly seem to matter, in trench coat pulls out, deliberate tension, arcing one arm, the other cradling a violin that isn't there, the air shoulder of it tucked beneath his chin. And then the bow that isn't there, lifted and lowered, performing the bowing precisely. No mimicry. He knows the music. On my side of the double tracks, the tunnel fills with a form of ennobled grief, too poised to be called an outcry, but still unmistakably that, contained, larger than any single suffering. And the man on the other side makes nothing, no sound at all, but answers adequately. What did I write on that card? The outcry, the response, the box in my hapless hands that have done so much to harm myself, the stupid small box. Thank you. Okay. Now, another experience that I know you have, I'm willing to bet everybody in this room has probably had this experience. You buy a used book without really looking inside. You get it home and you discover that you have purchased someone else's marginal notes, which can never be ignored. I regret to tell you this happened to me with an edition of Leaves of Grass. And I was on my way to teach a workshop, and I was in a strange town. I forgot my book. I ran in a used bookstore, and of course, every used bookstore has a copy of Leaves of Grass, right? I buy it, I don't even look. What is the grass? Oh, and I want to tell you. I wanted to teach section 6 of Song of Myself, which is the part that begins, a child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. What is the grass? On the margin, in the used text I've purchased without opening, pale, green, dutiful vessel, some unconvinced student has written, in a clear, looping hand, "Isn't it grass?" How could I answer the child? I do not exaggerate. I think of her question for years. And while first I imagine her the very type of the incurious, revealing the difference between a mind at rest and one that cannot, later I come to imagine that she had faith in language. That was the difference. She believed that the word settled things. The matter need not be looked into again. And he who'd written his book over and over, nearly ruining it, so enchanted by what had first compelled him, for him the word settled nothing at all. Which is why Leaves of Grass is this big. Walt might have finished a book and written another one, but no. Oh, you may have seen within the last couple of years, on the cover of the National Geographic magazine, it was an extraordinary photograph of the best preserved specimen of a mammoth ever found, an infant mammoth. It appeared in Siberia after the frozen mud bank thawed due to climate change. And I tried to, immediately I wanted to describe that thing, and I tried writing a poem about the mammoth that remained absolutely lifeless. And after a while, I realized that the mammoth needed to be the speaker in the poem. Little mammoth. Mother's milk in my belly, and a little of her excrement too, so that I might eat of the sour green steppes that opened endlessly before me. Though not long after I slid into sunlight and the grass world, I slid again into the mud hole and screaming sucked clay into my trunk till I lay on the bottom, my milk tusks not even sprouted, a sweet undercoat of fat, ready for my first winter. And I am still 1 month old and 40,000 years without my mother. It's really fun to make people make that noise. This poem requires a little bit of, or perhaps would benefit from a little bit of context. It's set in Fire Island Pines. Fire Island is a barrier island on the south shore of Long Island. It's about 20 miles long, very, very skinny. And it has several different communities. And one of them, Fire Island Pines, is historically a gay men's resort. It has a very specific culture. There are no motor vehicles there, so you'd walk, or there are sometimes little carts going around. There is the result of having no cars is that wildlife is astonishingly more present. And I didn't think so much about what the automobile had done to our fellow creatures until I spent time there, and was so aware of the presence of our fellows. There is a ritual on Fire Island called tea dance. They claim it began there, and it's become a sort of part of gay culture, probably internationally. A late afternoon, early evening cocktail hour. Excellent for a place that has no streetlights, because you could walk home without falling off the boardwalk. I think that's all I need to tell you. And there's a sort of rare word in the poem, gnomon. A gnomon is the dial on a sundial, the thing that casts the shadow. It's called King of Fire Island. Hard by our fence in tea dance light, he seemed the very model of his kind. A buck in velvet at the garden rim, bronze lightly shagged, split thumbs of antlers budding. That odd way deer hold extra still, as though there were degrees of stasis. We were objects of his regal, mild regard. Did I really say tea? Measure the afternoon by a bar event? Here, it's a fixed point, gnomon of the day. Our island's scattered men gather near 7 and stand with cocktails in the thick of buzzing bodies, intent in quick talk, though their subtle eyes won't miss a trick. Here, after all, tea dance started. Wise strategy for an island with no street lamps, boardwalks pitching along the dunes, scary after drinks, far better navigated before nightfall. He stepped toward us, an unexpected lurch, and then we saw one front leg merely tapered to a whisper, like the torso of a cartoon ghost. No hoof. He gladly accepted a carrot, a gesture plainly familiar. Where else could he have lived? No cars, no hunting, visitors who'd bring him kitchen scraps, nothing to trouble but cameras with their automatic flash or dance music booming from some big box rental. And ticks. He wore a small crown of swollen passengers between his two brave ears where he could not bite them, and no other deer provided the seemingly secret grooming they perform. He exhaled a small puff of carrot-scented wind. Handsome face expressive, not much in doubt of the human. We'd see him evenings up the walk, browsing the cranberry bog. He hauled himself through gardens, intently working tufts of grass, muscled shoulder pulling him ahead. A hoof's a deft accomplishment, that hard sheen shoe of blue-black carbon, but he'd learned to do with what he had. I brought him celery. He liked corn silk, but not the husks, and seemed to prefer the leaves of sassafras with their faint spice scent. Something, did I imagine it, seemed to pass across his gaze as he took them in, lower jaw working horizontally, a faint tearing sound. Then he'd take his tongue to my hands. They startled me at first, those sucking lips around my fingertips, careful, as if he were grooming another of his kind. I felt I could lay my hand on that long slope of forehead or stroke behind the ears, though whatever was left of his wildness needed to stand. I tried to name him. He wanted no word from me. More likely I should be subject to this monarch of holly, hobbling prince of Shadblow Grove, our island's crippled king. When July mounted to its zenith, his antlers turned in oddly, each mirroring the other. Wouldn't they collide? What grows in toward itself, how can it find company among its kind? I went looking, spent daylilies in hand, but if a white tail flashed, it wasn't his. Paul said, you can't will him to show up. Out there somewhere, in the leaf realms of August, lurching alone through all that glory. In the distance, the party thundered, season climbing to its apogee. Big speakers dragged out to the shore where midnight lapped the snow fence, and dreamers swayed and danced, held one another or themselves. And though the artificial mist tried to complicate the twittering sky field of laser lights, a real fog put the false to shame. In November, Paul saw him grazing a thicket by the yellowing bog. Not again. Then, late winter, a hushed, not quite scrutable rumor on the ferry, a deer's head floating in the bay, wreathed with flowers, evidence of ritual murder, Santeria, never to be mentioned again. Bad for business. Knowledge no summer renter required. My friend, have I any right to call him that? He could hardly flee. But listen, I saw my own severed head slip to the floor, a glazed, paltry thing, open eye looking up toward my subjectivity as if through a bloody gel. So much for the notion you can't die in a dream. I was the witness I've always been. Likewise beheaded, would you allow me now to do what I would not when you were living, and take in my hands twin branches sturdy as oars? Can't I take hold of you in the water, in the dark, floating in the gift of flowers, not lurching, steady, easy? Now guide me out of the story, Spirit. I don't know where it is you lead, but I believe. You must have been weary of that form, as I grow weary of my head, and leave it behind, cast-off thing, and lend my body to your severed crown. Okay, I'm going to end with a poem set in Jersey City. What more can be said? It's a poem, it's built upon the model of the house that Jack built with its recurrent lines. Each stanza ends with a version of the same line, and each stanza is one line longer than the one before, so you can sort of hear it stack up. House of Beauty. In Jersey City, on Tonawee Avenue, The House of Beauty is burning. On a Sunday morning in January, under the chilly shadow of the Pulaski Skyway, the House of Beauty is burning. Who lobbed the fire bottle through the glass, in among the creams and thrones, the helmets and clippers and combs? Who set the House of Beauty burning? In the dark recess beside the sink, where heads lay back to be laved under the perfected heads rode along the walls, the hopeful photographs of possibility darken, now that the House of Beauty is burning. The skyway beetles in the ringing cold, trestle arcing the steel river and warehouses, truck lots and Indian groceries, a new plume of smoke joining the others, billow of dark thought rising from the broken forehead of the House of Beauty. An emission almost too small to notice just now, alarm still ringing, the flames new launched on their project of ruining an effort at pleasure, glass jutting like cracked ice in the window frame. No one inside, the fire department on the way. All things, by nature, wrote Virgil, are ready to get worse. No surprise then that the House of Beauty is burning. Though whatever happens, however far these fires proceed, reducing history to powder, whatever the House of Beauty made is untouchable now. Nothing can undo so many heads made lovely, or at least acceptable. So much shapelessness given what are called permanence, though nothing holds a fixed form. Bring on the flames. What does it matter if the house is burning? Propose a new beauty, perennially unhoused. Neither the lost things nor the fire itself, but the objects in their dresses of disaster. Anything clothed in its own passage. Padded vinyl chair burst into smoky tongues. Lucite helmet sagged to a new version of its dome. Our black bridge, a charred rainbow on iron legs, two ruby eyes glowering from its crown. If beauty is burning, what could you save? The House of Beauty is a house of flames. Thank you. So we have a little time for questions, and while you're thinking about that, you might enjoy knowing that the House of Beauty apparently collected the insurance money now, neon and big signs, and it's quite something. A great makeover. I'd be happy to address, whatever you might like to hear about. Yeah.
I'm a great fan of your creative nonfiction.
Thank you.
How does your memoir work inform your poetry and vice versa?
It's been shifting relationship between memoir and poetry. At first, after my first memoir, I felt freed up from needing to tell stories in poems, and my poems got shorter and could move differently. And then after a while, I missed telling stories in poems, so it came back. I felt that there was material that was much more appropriate for nonfiction because I could build a lot of context and stop and meditate on a subject and diverge in a way that you can in poetry to a degree, but the poet is always trying to maintain that tautness of language. And even a long poem is a highly compressed object. And when you have all those beautiful pages to spread out, you can move in so many ways. So it's a sort of an oscillation between compression and expansion that's very pleasing to me. Yeah. And also, I really believe that poets need something else to do. Because it's not a healthy thing. It's too much pressure, right? And there's a way in which I think you need to step away and write reviews or paint or do something else that also makes use of that creative impulse. And prose has been that for me, one of the things. Yeah.
I guess sort of dovetailing that, one of my favorite works of yours is Still Life with
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
And, there's wonderful poetry in that, the lemon is the sexiest fruit,
right, yeah.
Things like that. But I'm interested in your perspective of saying what grabs your attention in that way to lead you through a book-length work, to approach it from 10 different aspects, both personally
right.
and academically, intellectually in that way?
Sure. The book that the questioner is describing begins with an encounter with a 17th century Dutch still life in the Metropolitan Museum. Extraordinary, rather modest painting that somehow absolutely seized my attention. And I'd always thought still lifes were sort of boring. I just didn't get it. And suddenly there was this still life that just seemed to me so deeply saturated in feeling and human presence, even though no human being is represented. It's food, it's utensils, that's all that's there. So I sat with that experience for a while, and it probably would have become a poem, except that there was a wonderful editor at that time at Beacon Press who called me up and said, would you like to write a 100-page book? And I said, about what? She said, whatever you want. And a 100-page book, it's a really nice invitation, right? Because I don't think I would write a 300-page book about a Dutch still life. But 100 pages is long enough to create depth, but short enough to take a risk. And if you write 100 pages and you fall on your face, then you do. Okay. It was just the right size. And so I first described the encounter with the painting, and then I thought, now what? And I began to imagine if I could paint a still life, what resonant objects would I put in it? And that led to the next section of the book, and began a pattern of oscillation between the Dutch painters, who are endlessly fascinating to read about, and my own experience with things. And so back and forth we go, and suddenly I have a structure for a book. Yeah, that's how. So thinking about what will this yield, and what is the sort of intuitive process of what kind of, do we want the laser beam of a poem? Do we want the expansive consideration and meditation of prose? The poem I read you called King of Fire Island could not be nonfiction. It can't happen, because there's something about the, what I hope is a kind of vibrating lyrical intensity about the speaker's address to the dead deer at the end, now can I go with you, that is poetic by nature, huh? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question I'm not quite sure how to ask. I've heard you read many times, and I am always quite emotional hearing your work, and I struggle thinking, I mean, it's obviously both, but I struggle, there's emotion of what is sometimes real pain about the world, and sometimes I'm just emotional by the absolute beauty that you're able to capture.
Thank you.
And I guess what I wonder is how concerned are you with the readers or listeners' emotion versus your emotion? How concerned are you in your writing process that I have the emotion that you want me to have or not?
I'm very concerned that you have an experience. And I think probably what happens for most of us is the poem begins in something we need to make for ourselves. There's the pressure or irritation or anxiety of not understanding something, or that need to speak something which is inchoate. And as one begins to write and to give shape to the poem, in my experience, the self starts backing up. The maker takes over, and it becomes finally more about the experience that you're going to have than the experience that I am having, which is a great gift. I believe that is probably the only way in which writing is actually therapeutic, that you get to distance yourself from your experience in order to hand it to another person. And the mystery is, I don't feel I have any control at all over what you feel. Who knows where you're going to go with it, but I know I can, if I work hard enough, I can make an object that strikes some common chord of intensity in human feeling, and will vibrate. And I only know that because people look at me at readings with that gaze, that says, I'm there with you. It's amazing to me. It might be the world's best cure for loneliness, Yeah. Yeah.
There's something trance-like in some of your closer descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, Elizabeth Bishop said, I see how closely I can say this. She said, what one wants in experiencing art is the same thing one wants in the making of it, which is a self-forgetful, perfectly useless concentration. And I love that statement. I think that letting oneself pour into the object of one's attention, it is a kind of trance in a way, because you push away all the concerns of the day, you get out of thinking about the past and anticipating the future and move into the now of encounter with the thing, okay? So in that way, the Dutch still life becomes suddenly a vibrating occasion of perception in the moment, and it sort of paradoxically lifts you out of yourself and takes you deeper into yourself at once, if that makes any sense. Yeah? So, yeah. And I would hope that trance-like quality, as you described it, would be sort of contagious, that if the writer is engaged in that way, that the reader could be drawn into an act of contemplation that has a similar intensity or tone.
I just read your book on description, and I wonder if you could fold into that. One of the things the thing that surprised and delighted me about that book is though it claims to be about description, it seemed to me it was really about metaphor, and in a good way. And I wonder if you could talk about that too, how when you're describing an object, that metaphor.
Sure. And this is related to the previous question. The thesis of this little book, which is part of this wonderful, the art of the craft books that Grave was doing. I remember when Fiona asked me, "You would write the art of what?" And I said, "Description." I don't think I missed a beat. It's just I knew that's where I wanted to go. And for me, there is really no such thing as objective description. When we say what we see, it is a form of self-portraiture. You were evoking your own perception. And the more closely we look, and the more we can articulate how we see, the more of the self can be revealed. So that is metaphoric in the sense that whatever we're looking at, the three-legged deer, the shoes of the young man in the therapy group become vessels in which we can invest personal content. That is often very hard to get at directly. If I'm asked, "What do you think, Mark?" or "What do you feel?" I often don't have words for that. But the vehicle becomes the means of discovery. This book was so much fun to write this thing because it actually was an excuse to read a lot of wonderful poems and try to think about the work they did in representing physical reality, which is often a way that we do not talk about poetry and what it does. This came about in part because in the 90s, later 90s, I was teaching in Iowa, and I had this realization when one of my students brought in a poem in which there was a description of a flock of birds, that it was the first time in the semester that the world had appeared in a poem in our class. The external world. I was like, thank you. We've forgotten about Wittgenstein's footnotes for the moment, and we can move on to look at some birds. Hallelujah. And it's not that that's other thing. Mental processes and language are, of course, enormously interesting in themselves, but language by nature refers, right? Every word is connected to the external world. Writing began in imitation of natural forms. The Egyptian hieroglyph for writing represents a crab because it's the scuttling marks of the crab on sand resemble some kind of handwriting, yeah? So words have in their roots, in their cores, the inheritance of physical reality, of the perception of things. And I think that we forget about representing the world at our peril. And I don't mean we do it easily. I don't mean there's a knowable world we can all agree upon out there, but the struggle to identify and to connect the self to the world seems to me endlessly rewarding. Yeah.
Your connection between animals and humans, have you ever gone too far?
Next question. You want to say more about what you mean? I'm teasing you. Say more about what you mean. You mean anthropomorphizing the animal?
I think of the seals and the dogs in Heaven's Coast, and there's almost a human quality to them, but you're not, I'm not going to say the word right, anthropomorphizing. You've
Right.
stopped short. Have you ever gone too far where you've had to back off from that, or not? How do you deal with that connection?
It's a very good question because one of the real challenges of writing about animal life is granting them their otherness, and writing which sort of assimilates them in some way, I think is doing a disservice to the otherness of those consciousnesses, which is so important that we figure out ways to know and to the extent we can and to respect. This came particularly to the fore for me in writing his book Dog Years, which is a full-length memoir about living with dogs. And I thought, suppose I say to you, I am writing a 300-page book about my pets. I expect you to glaze over, right? And sort of immediately. And so my challenge is to make it fast-moving, funny, and to really make the dogs actual characters who you want to know without making them cute or without sort of turning them into extensions of me. There's only a degree to which one can do that, but trying to be vigilant about it seemed really helpful. And I would, we were talking a little bit today, Tracy and I were talking about the not knowing as a crucial part of the poem and a crucial part of nonfiction, I think, too. Making the space for what we don't know, allowing questions, admitting ignorance or that wall beyond which we cannot penetrate seems to me so essential. And so often, developing writers think you have to be certain of what you say. I have to believe this, I have to know what I'm saying. And the best teacher in the world for helping one tackle that is Emily Dickinson, who says sometimes, death is a yawning, cold nothing, and sometimes death is a suitor coming to take you on a date, and sometimes death is, contemplating the resurrection, and sometimes it's paradisiacal. What does Emily Dickinson believe? Well, it's beside the point, isn't it? It's a series of inquiries, of almost scientifically, a series of hypotheses that are being tested in the poem. Yeah. So I always encourage my students, say, you don't have to believe it, what you say. Try it, see where it takes you. Yeah. Ultimately, you probably the stakes are very high, you probably do have to believe it finally, but you have to act as if you don't. Yeah. Okay. Are we done? I believe we're done. Thank you. Good night.